Hi, everybody. It's Chris Frew with BioBuzz here today with another episode of our Ask Me Anything series around careers in biotech. It's been really exciting to do these weekly programs for everybody. We've been covering a lot of different careers from flow cytometry to quality. And today we're talking all about supply chain and logistics with someone who I've known for quite a while, Andrew Buscemi, who is Associate Director of Supply Chain at REGENXBIO in here in Maryland. Andrew, welcome today.
Yeah, good to be here, Chris. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I appreciate you jumping on for 45 minutes or so with us today.
Of course.
Andrew, as we talked about these programs we've been doing, because BioBuzz is really all about helping to better connect employers with available and flexible talent. So that goes across the supply chain of talent, if you will, from entry level to subject matter experts. So one of the things we're doing is we're really trying to shed light on all the different fields and careers there are in biotech. And that's a big goal of this series, is to really kind of lift the veil, if you will, because, we hear all the time, like, you have somebody in the lab and they say, well, what happens over in that department? I really don't know. So hopefully after today, we'll help unveil a little bit about what happens in supply chain and logistics for us. And maybe sway someone over to kind of turn their career in your direction.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. It's an awesome thing because at all the companies I've been at too, the same question comes up. It's, what does everybody really do on a day to day? So I think this is a great thing that what you're doing to share across companies, but even with them as well too. So good stuff, Chris.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we start off with a little bit about you? Do you mind just kind of doing an intro for the audience here? Tell us a little bit about who you are, how you got into this field, and kind of give us a little bit of a foundation.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the biotech industry for a little over 8 years now. Always had a passion for science, but didn't exactly know what direction that would take me. So when I went to school, I did get my degree in biology. However, when I graduated, couldn't really find anything specifically in the field there. So I ended up doing a bit of a pivot, which started my real supply chain and logistics career. I started working with a sales partner for DHL out in the Bay Area in California back in 2006. So while that wasn't exactly where I thought I may have taken that direction, leaving school, I'm very thankful that I did. It's a great experience getting into the logistics industry, really seeing how businesses not only move product, but kind of have some of that planning aspect about that. Very cool time and place as well. I got to meet with a lot of cool companies, 23andMe when they were small, even LinkedIn and some other ones in that area. So definitely a great way to start the career. But after being in that business for about 10 years, I learned a lot of that from that in terms of, collaborating with the right people to make decisions with companies. But I wanted to get back to that scientific route. So having that biology degree, I had moved back to the Maryland area from San Francisco, and I had a friend who worked at the GSK Rockville Biofarm sites. And I had saw on their posted openings that they had a logistics planner role. And for me, it was kind of a parting of the clouds and the sun coming down and saying, this is a great synergy from my previous experience to what they're looking at here, and being able to get back into something that I truly love. So even having that in there, I would say that was a pretty lengthy process. I think it still took about 4 months to get through everything. So one thing I would say there is, don't get frustrated about that. I think we've all been that, regardless of the field of what it is. You find something, it looks like the perfect fit, you're still getting responses on there, but it seems to take a while. So one thing I'd say is just keep sticking with it in the beginning there. But I eventually did get hired on as a logistics planner, did that for a couple of years for them, transitioned into a more above site role, doing global planning for them. So we had 3 different production streams at that facility, and I was responsible for synthesizing some of the demand that we was coming through, both clinical, commercial, whatever it may be, and then providing a recommended manufacturing schedule to meet those demands. Back in 2020, right as the pandemic was coming upon us, I was contacted by a good friend who used to run the site over at GSK, and it transitioned over to REGENXBIO, and telling me what a great place this was. Some exciting things are happening in the gene therapy field. What a great culture that was going on here. And at the time, I said, I'm not really looking, pretty happy with where I'm at, but I never want to close the door before it opens. So I talked to him, and it turned out to be a really exciting opportunity. One of the things that really intrigued me about that is we were on the cusp of building our own internal manufacturing facility. So up until that point, all of REGENXBIO manufacturing had been CMO based, and we have since brought that in-house, started manufacturing internally in 2022. But I was brought on as a senior manager of supply chain, really responsible for the planning team. So raw material ordering, supplier relationship management, and some of that plant planning as well too, as we were both for the internal management and then some of the external stuff that we still had with the CMOs. So been here for just about 4 years now. In March was my 4-year anniversary, which can't believe how quick that flown by. But a lot of the same focus is kind of in my day to day. We're still focusing on making sure that we've got the raw materials to be able to run here. And then also it's kind of evolved into a next level as well with kind of, okay, we're up and running, we've got our feet off the ground, and now we're looking at more kind of risk mitigation and security of supply. So implementing those process improvements just to make sure that we're taking as much risk out of the process as possible. So
yeah,
it's been a great journey for sure. And
that's a really fascinating. Yeah, fascinating journey. I have a question for you. Did you make REGENXBIO wait 4 months, like they previously, like they could see what it was like? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, exactly. You got to take learnings from those experiences.
Right.
Thankfully,
right.
yeah, that moved a little quicker on that regard too. So,
yeah.
But yeah.
Well, REGENXBIO is doing some really interesting things, and the gene therapy space, is definitely been, you've been part of, over the past 4 years, there's been a lot of evolution. But if we could take a step back too, before, as you just got in, tell us, what was it like, any lessons or any takeaways from transitioning into a biopharma logistics role from outside of the biopharma industry? Any takeaways or advice you would have for people?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a bit intimidating at that point in time. I had been in the logistics industry for 10 years, focusing a lot on international shipping. So I was familiar with, some customs clearance, Incoterms, things like that across the board. But it's a whole different animal when you're working for, a bulk drug substance manufacturing site and having to get that material out internationally. So heavily cold chain, obviously white glove services that were needed. So definitely a bit outside of, I would say, my comfort zone on there. But we had a really great partner, 3PL, third-party logistics provider that we used at that point in time. So I leveraged a lot of their expertise, but then also just the other groups internally, the SOPs and the process that we already had built. I think it was kind of fortunate coming into GSK as it was, being an already commercial site that had these processes built. Mm-hmm. So I could learn a bit on there, but then still kind of take a look at that with a different, an outside set of eyes to say, oh, these are some, potential process improvements that we may be able to build in. But yeah, I'd be lying if I said, I just jumped in and from day one, it's like, okay, this is how it's going to go. It's a bit of a learning curve on there. A new industry too, that I honestly didn't realize. I didn't know the difference between upstream and downstream manufacturing and production. Mm-hmm. So even though that wouldn't be like directly related to getting product from point A to point B, it was definitely helpful to learn those other aspects as well, to learn about the timing of when I may be able to get the material and different aspects on there. So yeah, I mean, like I say, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a little intimidating at some points in time, but I feel like those kind of areas where you maybe feel a little uncomfortable at some points are really where, you're growing on there.
Mhm.
If everything you're doing every day feels comfortable and normal on there, you're probably not pushing those limits and trying to grow your capabilities as a person. That's what I see.
Amen to that. Amen to
Yeah.
that. You got to live a little bit in the uncomfortable zone.
Yeah, exactly. And then after a while, you're like, oh, it turns into a bit more of a routine thing, and you feel good about it. But no,
A
it's
couple of years later, you're building the logistics plan from scratch, right?
exactly. So yeah, there was a lot of lessons learned taken from there that we're doing, and that we'll still be applying. In terms of things like shipping validations and distribution risk assessments and things like that. So it's
Yeah.
the trajectory was great for me to be able to kind of get my feet under me at GSK, and then kind of bring some of that knowledge to REGENXBIO.
That's great. I guess the other question I would have that I think might be helpful for our audience as well, kind of taking a 10,000-foot view or so, could you
Yep.
paint a picture of like what is supply chain and logistics? What are the main buckets or components? Like, how can you maybe help paint a picture of what that actually means? Like I said, we often hear from people in other groups, like what goes on over there. So I know supply chain and logistics is a pretty broad kind of umbrella.
Yeah.
And the bigger the organization, the more, different segments you have. But could you try to, take a stab at that? Like, kind of give a broad stroke of kind of what all falls under those elements.
Yeah, sure. And thinking about this as you mentioned it, I see this as pretty similar across the organizations that I've had experience with. So I wouldn't say this is just REGENXBIO specifically. But I think for a lot of people, when they hear supply chain, it's more that kind of raw material procurement side of the things and kind of supplier relationship management. It's okay, we need these chemicals, these consumables, these single-use assemblies, and everything else to be able to run our process. And it's the culmination of managing the suppliers and getting things in when we need to, and having all that stuff released and available for manufacturing. So that is 100% a big piece of what my team runs, the planning team here. The other piece that falls under planning, as I kind of alluded to before, is that a bit more shorter term manufacturing planning, where you're saying, okay, again, synthesizing demand that you get, whether it's clinical or commercial demand, and saying, all right, we need to run this many batches in Q1 of this product and this many batches of the other product in Q2 or whatever the case may be. So that's the planning bucket. I think one that doesn't get as much recognition as it should for how critical it is to the success of companies is really the materials management side of things as well. At both companies that I've worked with, they're a really integral partner for us to be able to execute on the deliverables that we need to. And it's not something that I think that gets as much attention as that it may be. Materials management roles may not be the ones that people think that they really, or I should rephrase that. They may not think it'd be the first ones off the top of their head. They're like, I just really want to get into that piece of it. But I do think it's a great way also to get into supply chain, where maybe those planning roles aren't quite as open, or there's not as many at that point in time, but you have something with, kind of a more manager level and materials management. It's a great way to learn some of the processes around there. And then if something does get open up in planning, which is maybe where you more wanted to be, you've already got your foot in the door as well too. But materials management's obviously the one that's receiving everything, helping to get that transferred up to the manufacturing floors after we've gone through the whole release process as well too. The third pillar that I see, and I alluded to this before from the planning side, is that kind of clinical or commercial supply team who are feeding that information into those. So depending on how the company's structured, those could be kind of completely separate groups. And a bigger company like GSK, they have their whole commercial supply team that's feeding stuff to us. And here at REGENXBIO, we have a clinical supply team that's kind of managing some of the more, not only the demand, but then overseeing getting that drug to the actual hospitals or the service providers so they can minister to the patients. So yeah, in summary, it's really those three buckets. There's the planning team, the materials management team, and then the kind of clinical or commercial supply team.
Yeah. And especially, from what I've learned with the growth of cell therapy and gene therapy as a product, I mean, when you're talking, one product, one patient, supply chain and the you know the end, that last mile, or that kind of supply chain total loop is actually more important than ever before, because it becomes very critical getting the product out.
Yeah, no, 100%. I didn't really see that in my experience with GSK before. You know, we were kind of a little further upstream in the supply chain side of just making the BDS and getting that to the fill sites for that to get filled into the vials and then packaged and labeled. But yeah, seeing here at Regenx what the clinical supply team does to not only help us to get to where we need to go, but then managing that process of actually getting the drug handled and administered to the patients in a GMP compliant manner to make sure that they're getting the material in good integrity is it's a lot, because they're having to train these different people. Each site has different capabilities, even in terms of freezer space, for example, or just other things there. So they're always having to think of kind of maybe out of the box solutions, and you can't just put everybody in that same kind of A happens and then goes to B and C. So yeah, it's amazing what those teams can do.
Yeah, so it's an exciting field, that continues to get, I think that in biotech, when, we used to work in like large batch production like GSK, to now
Yep.
we're getting to this, precision medicine, supply chain is becoming, a growing, field of interest in life sciences and biotech because of that. So
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of different engaging areas where people can find what niche they will want to be in that as well too.
yeah, that's great.
Yep.
So we've got some questions coming in. Before we jump into that, let me just ask you real quick. Are there any skills or anything you would recommend people to kind of brush up on, or especially if they're transitioning into biotech from other industries, say coming in from the military or coming from DHL or some other, what advice would you have, or what type of skills do you think are important for someone to be able to showcase or learn?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really saw at both companies, and especially so at Regenx here, being a little bit more on the clinical stage of our life cycle, is supply chain just touches a whole lot of different groups. So not only just when material comes in here and working with our quality team to get things released, and then working with manufacturing to get them the materials they need, but especially just on the project management side of things as well too. I see a lot of times there's cross-functional initiatives within companies, and supply chain is pretty uniquely positioned because they have these interactions with so many of the different teams to take on a kind of a project management role on there. So I think strong PM skills are definitely a benefit on to being able to get into supply chain as well. If maybe you're just in a different field or department within a company and looking to get have more exposure there, I think that's pretty helpful. Mm-hmm. And just having that general flexibility, because everybody's got a plan on here, and there's always going to be a curveball that comes in. Mm-hmm. So being able to kind of respond to those change and kind of using clear and concise communication to be able to not only convey that to stakeholders, but then also be able to manage team members and hold them accountable to be able to execute deliverables would be a big one on there as well too. But yeah, I mean, specifically also the other thing that I've seen people utilize as a way to get into the supply chain side of things, or really any departments, if your company offers secondments, I would highly recommend looking into stuff like that, where you can spend a quarter or 50% of your time kind of shadowing and working with another department, and really kind of getting your feet wet and seeing if it's something that is aligned with the next stage in your career growth.
Yeah, it's good advice. It's good advice. Yeah. I had a manager early in my career said, "Never waste a lunch." He's like, so companies now are doing those where you can do shadows, but back 20 years ago when I was getting started in the industry, it was like, never waste a lunch. So I was like, I was interested in certain things, and just go sit next to the lunchroom.
Yeah, and then in the same vein, I mean, I know mentoring is kind of maybe not something that's always on the forefront, but really, identifying that with kind of a senior member of whatever department that you may be wanting to get into. And yeah, whether that's just a lunch with them, once a month or something a bit more structured, I think that's a great way to not only develop those skills and kind of ask those questions you have, but also start to build that networking, even within your company and then across other ones as well too. Because obviously, as you know, in BioBuzz, the networking is key. I wouldn't have gotten my foot in the door with GSK without that contact on there, and that continues within the company, or even when you are looking to kind of switch and make a bit more of a bigger career move too. So every relationship you build, you never know what's going to happen from it. So always, treating people right and keeping your best foot forward there.
It's a small industry in biotech, so that's true. So, but yeah, I agree. Networking, we've been supporting networking across biotech for a long time, and we've got a drawer full of feedback and stories around people who met co-founders or got their next job, and sometimes, like you had a friend at GSK. Sometimes you do need that person on the inside that'll just say, "Hey, listen, give this person an interview and give them a shot," and that can go a long way.
No, it can, because I mean, there's obviously the other things you can do to build, your case and resume, certifications and other things around there. So those I fully support stuff like that as well too. But I feel like the combination of both is obviously the more powerful case to get you where you need to go.
Indeed. Well, Andrew, let's jump into a couple questions that have come in. Is that okay? We're going to switch over to some user questions. This isn't Ask Me Anything, so we had a question coming from John O'Brien about REGENX, and I guess this could be broad across any company, really. But how do you coordinate or consolidate demand from clinical trials? To the extent projected sales as well, but like in the clinical world, flexibility set is needed. So as things change rapidly, how do you consolidate that? Kind of bake that in and pivot accordingly. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and again, gets back to those different kind of pillars of supply chain that we were talking about, and the planning side and the demand planning is obviously a huge one. And this isn't specific to REGENX or GSK. I mean, every company that I've seen has some version of this. So whether it's clinical demand coming from the clinical supply team, or there's a more mature commercial demand, there's that connection between that piece, whether they're branch of supply chain or a completely separate one, where that's getting fed into the planning team, and you have a manufacturing schedule. Typically, I see companies building that short-term manufacturing planning from about 2 to 3 years. So the manufacturing operations and other supporting groups can plan their schedules around there, end of year shutdowns, all the other things kind of building into that. But that demand is typically fed into the planning team, and then our outputs will be a manufacturing recommendation on there. The one thing that I'd say is constant, especially for clinical stage companies, probably even more so, is that change and having that basically ability to respond to change. So I think you implement those risk mitigations that I alluded to in the beginning, kind of across different nodes of the supply chain. And the further you get down, probably the more safety stock you really need to implement on there. So I think that's working with those clinical and commercial teams too, to identify safety stock levels that you may need for your FDP or your final drug product. The same thing on the bulk drug substance of BDS side of things. But then even on the raw material ordering strategy, I'm sure most people are familiar with those safety stock levels, but that was kind of one of those immediate process improvements that I wanted to implement as soon as we got our feet off the ground. It's okay, we built a facility in COVID. We've finally got everything that we need to run. It's like, what do we need to do to make sure that we don't get into a situation where we're scrambling again? So, yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer to this is just an overall, the first piece is just that synthesizing the demand that we're given, and how to respond to change. I think is just taking a very risk mitigation based approach, and a big piece of that is is proper safety stock level setting across the different supply nodes of the supply chain. And a lot of that can vary too, from what type of manufacturing process you have. If you have more of a platform process, that's a little bit more uniform across the board, a bit easier for supply chain to manage there. But if you're running multiple products or molecules or whatever the case may be that have very different bill of materials, then it's a bit more of a complex planning process then. But one thing I'd advise is making sure you're getting all your stakeholders in there and that people are signing off on the overall approach to mitigating that risk as much as you can.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. So John asked a follow-up question on that a little bit is how much regulatory insight do you need in supply chain, or as personnel, do personnel need to know and have to know? Is there a lot of communication regarding, like, the different NDA or MA filings, and how does commercial supply chain influence or get involved when it comes to that?
The short answer is quite a bit, and the longer one is it really depends on the life cycle of where your company is at that point in time. So for a more clinical stage company, if you're still in kind of phase 1 and 2, you've got quite a bit more flexibility to implement secondary suppliers, other process improvements in there. But once you've done, a PPQ batch, or you're moving into kind of those phase 3 trials, those processes are really getting a bit more locked in there, and any changes are going to be part of, an amendment to an IND or a different, piece of the BLA that may be filed. For a more commercial organization, I would say supply chain is even more closely involved with that regulatory piece, because you have the whole post-approval change management process that needs to be implemented, and that can be a bit of a bear in how you manage that. A lot of techniques that I've seen are setting up multiple SKUs in your ERP system. So when you're entering in those demand and building those manufacturing schedules that I talked about before, you may have a universal SKU that can go to all markets, but maybe there's some other process improvement that process development wants to put in to get higher yields. But obviously that will take some time with all the filings that need to happen on there. So maybe you get US approval first. So you have a new SKU that can really only be supplied to US at that point in time. And as it goes through to Canada, Japan, or whatever other approvals, you're going through that. So yeah, I think, again, kind of the short answer is, for a clinical company, you've got a bit more flexibility on there really until that BLA gets filed. But for a commercial one, you're going hand in hand and really getting down to that granular level of planning, to saying this is the SKUs that we're making for the demand that can be supplied to this market, and any changes that are going through there. We're coordinating with regulatory and making sure that proper post-approval change management process is being followed.
Yeah, that's
it's
interesting.
No good making material for even if you've got the supply there, but you can't send it to that country because those changes that you use to make that drug wasn't fully vetted there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Good question, John. I guess building on that, you mentioned ERP systems. How Deepa Kumar asked, how well do you need to know ERP systems before being considered for a role, or in the field? I mean, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an integral piece to what we use every day, and running demand planning, not only taking that manufacturing schedule that we talk, and then translating that through the bill of materials, and having the system provide planning recommendations for materials that you need for manufacturing, maintaining safety stock levels. So yeah, having an understanding of them in general is definitely a critical aspect. I would say that a couple of the main ones, being SAP, Oracle, things like that. There's some other kind of more in-house or proprietary ones. Having that general understanding of the framework of how they work, I think, is more important when applying or moving into a new role than knowing that specific system itself. that's something, at least for me, when I'm looking to hire people for my team, I can teach that type of things. Those are skills that can be learned. I'm more looking for that type of open attitude and the willingness to learn new things. And again, kind of getting back to what we were talking about before, like I may not be totally comfortable about this, but I can look at this as a learning opportunity to build those skills. So again, if a company says they're using SAP and you've got great SAP experience, that's a gold star there to help you along with the process. But at the same point in time, if you don't know that and that's the system that they're using, I wouldn't ever look at that as something to say I don't think we'd be able to move forward with this role just because of that there. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't let that discourage anybody from moving forward with a position that looks good otherwise.
Yeah. And well, building on top of that, Andrew, like, is there any advice you'd have? We got Deep also commented, about the challenge of getting into a supply chain role at a manager level and up, especially if you don't have the exact experience, but you've got supply chain experience from like collaborating with supply chain teams, and maybe you're coming from another department. So again, like, if you've worked closely with supply chain, understand it, but have not been in supply chain role, any recommendations or thoughts on how you would recommend someone approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of different, again, supply chain touches a lot of different pieces. So we work closely with procurement here, but procurement is a different functional group. So if you were coming from a procurement role, I think there's a lot of lessons and aspects that you see of those workings that can be applied. And I think that's something to highlight when you're talking to a prospective hiring company. I mean, we talked on certifications and stuff before. Those obviously can't hurt and give you a bit more of a background depending on how distant your current role may have been from supply chain as well. But I think highlighting some of those skills that we talked about before and the process management, the ability to respond to change and other things, that's going to really apply to any company when they're looking for any roles, but supply chain as well too, for how many functional groups that we touch on that.
Yeah.
So again, kind of similar with the ERP experience, if you don't have direct experience in the specific role that you're looking for, I would just think of how some other situations that you've been in your current role have showed how that you've tackled problems, helped to pull in different stakeholders and functional groups to meet goals on there, because that's at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same thing on here. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to highlight also, like you said earlier, networking and really kind of building out your network within industry. Because again, my experience when you are switching departments or roles, I mean, or just even jobs in general, like the idea. It's like this in sales, right? No matter what, you could have the best product and you could be a great fit for the role, or I could have the best product for a customer, but you need a champion who's going to be like, hey, let's give this a shot, especially in an industry like ours where there is a lot of general risk mitigation around everything.
Yeah, I agree. I wish I could have a magic wand to this and to deep this question a bit more. I mean, those manager levels and higher can be a bit more difficult because they have a bit more rigor into there. So that's where I would say just to be open to other things that may be ancillary to that. Again, speaking about the materials management piece or anything else, and getting your foot in the door how you can, and then you may have a more direct line to that exact role that you were looking for in the long run. So yeah, I would just say be open to possibilities, and as you mentioned, Chris, kind of leveraging those connections that you have, because I mean, you can do all the right things, check all the right boxes, but at the end of the day, there's a little bit of just you need the break to come your way that moment in time. So always said luck is the residue of desire, though. So if you put in the time in, I think eventually good things are going to happen.
It's a great quote. I like that. Well, as we start to get towards our wrap up here, Andrew, maybe you could think a little bit about the industry and where it's going. So, do you have any thoughts on where you see the most growth, or kind of trends in the industry?
Um, yeah, I guess a lot of my experience over the last 4 years here at Regenx has really been driven for standing up our internal manufacturing in a COVID world, and I think it's how has that changed how supply chain and logistics look moving forward, and I think it's kind of forced a lot of companies into really focusing on risk mitigation and how are we protecting our supply to eventually ensure that we're able to provide product to that patient at the end of the supply chain. Um, I know biotech in an industry is obviously risk mitigation is a huge aspect for everything, but I think that it's been extended even more around just the quality, the basic quality piece, and extending to all processes around the company, which is what I've seen. So I think again that's a bit more focused on where we're at in our life cycle here, but as a general industry trend, I think cell and gene therapy, which you touched on before, is an exciting field to be in. I got my start in the mAb side of things, and learning a lot on the C and GT side. There's a lot of lessons that could be gleaned from the previous one, but yeah, just the different processes on here as well. So
I had somebody once, I heard, and this was at a conference. They said, a modern cell therapy company's supply chain operates more like that kind of original Dell computer model than it does traditional large batch mAbs.
yeah, no, and I can see that too. And a lot of that also is just how companies set up their manufacturing too. Because if you have a stainless facility where you're have that equipment there that's just kind of being CIP'd and cleaned and everything from batch to batch versus setting up a single use facility, it's going to completely just change the way that your supply chain is driven overall. So that's those are two different areas where I had to do a lot of learning, kind of switching into the new side here and coming into a different way to approach those things, and again implementing those processes to make sure that we're not at risk of not having what we need to be able to run when we need to.
Yeah. You mentioned something else in terms of kind of trends. You said, but like the kind of quality culture, that seems to be a trend. You mentioned it, that just really baking quality into everything. I can imagine that's a huge part of your role, or a huge part of your focus is quality management. And
yeah, no, it really is, and I think those are the companies that are going to really doing the right thing the right way. A lot. I'd say all of us are in this industry because it's engaging, but at the end of the day, it feels good to, be helping people and feeling like what we do matters. So bringing these medicines to patients at the end of the supply chain that, could potentially change their life, it only works if we're doing it in the right way and making those decisions on a day-to-day process. I know sometimes it's hard when you're getting bogged down by the minutia, or you're having a crazy day or week and stuff. But I like the fact that at both locations that I've worked at, they like to bring it back to that patient focus attitude that we have on here by, whether that's at quarterly meetings, having some patients come in and see that, or see what the effect of our work is actually having in the real world for families out there. And I think keeping that in mindset on a day-to-day basis and keeping that quality aspect in mind as well too is critical for the success of a company. And I think that the good ones are really focusing on that, and that's what I've seen for the two I've been at.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that's a great way to end things. At the end of the day, it does always come back to the patients, and that's why we're all working here, and is ultimately to get product out to to the patient and change a life or save a life.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Any closing thoughts? Last sales pitch on why you should join Andrew in a exciting career in supply chain logistics?
I think you summed it up. It is an exciting career. It's rarely dull. You touch on so many aspects of the business. Again, I've touched on quality and the materials management side, but engineering, facilities, manufacturing. You have a piece in all that stuff. So yeah, I highly recommend, again, seeing if your company has secondments, either looking into mentoring roles, or just enter department lunch and learns, which we try and do as well too, just to spread that knowledge. But yeah, keep focusing on your network. You never know who's got it in somewhere on there. But yeah, that's it. That's about it, Chris.
That sounds good. Well, it's a great way to wrap up. Andrew, I really appreciate all your time today and the insights you shared. Hopefully there's less people asking that question now, like what goes on in supply chain and logistics. And again, of course, this program will live live on BioBuzz in our Career Center. So people will be able to access this, and you're on LinkedIn, correct? So that's when it comes to networking, that's probably one of the first places a lot of people start. So feel free to reach out to Andrew on LinkedIn, but just keep in mind he's busy. So he's juggling a big organization. But Andrew, this is great. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and you contributing to the community that we're trying to really build and to future careers. So
yes, indeed. No, thanks again for the invite, Chris. It's been a pleasure. Have a good one, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.